As we're gonna unpack, we're gonna uncover JFK. We're gonna be going through JFK. We're gonna be declassifying all the documents. Recently, this week, 60,000 documents were declassified. 60 out of the 80,000 that are meant to be, declassified out of the total. So yeah, we're gonna be going through, what it all means, and we're really gonna be going into a deep dive.
We're actually going to be going into a massive deep dive. So fasten your seatbelts because this is going to be one of the best episodes I've ever done.
So you were right. Lee Harvey Osborn was the suspected killer of John F. Kennedy. He, so what happened? So okay, basically this is the fundamentals of it. So 1963 was when JFK was assassinated. 1961 was when he was made president of the United States. And in 1963, he was basically in his car. It was like an open air car, and you probably know about it, open air car. And he basically got shot. They called it like an S road. So he was on the S, and he basically got shot while he was on the S. And the suspected killer was Lee Harvey Osborn. That's what everyone said. The bullet basically went through his chest and killed the driver in front of him, which was the governor, if I'm not wrong. And that's basically the story. So let's just go by the story. So the story is that Lee Harvey Osborn was the suspected killer. He was the suspected killer. He got interrogated by the police force right after he killed JFK. He was interrogated for 2 days. After his interrogation, he was transferred to jail, right? And while he was getting transferred to jail, he was shot and killed by a Jewish mobster called Jack Ruby. So while Lee Harvey Osborn was getting transferred to jail, he was killed by a Jewish mobster called Jack Ruby. Lee Harvey Osborn is the killer of,
Mm,
or suspected killer of JFK. So the story says
yeah.
that Lee Harvey Osborn was like the lone killer. There was no one else involved in the killing. He was alone, and there was no foreign influence involved as well. So there was not like Russia wasn't involved, Israel wasn't involved. That's how the story goes. And this is where, the story starts to, there's inconsistencies in the story. So the problem with Lee Harvey Osborn is that he was under constant CIA surveillance for years, years before even JFK was assassinated. I'll get into why he was, under CIA intelligence later, maybe after I'm done explaining everything, once I link it all back. But basically, what you need to understand for now is that he was under CIA intelligence for years and years and years, right? And this was prior to, JFK's assassination. And the day before JFK's assassination, there was a 190-page dossier about Lee Harvey Osborn to James Angeleton. James Angeleton was the head of counterintelligence in the United States. James Angeleton, he's a key player in the story. So remember James Angleton. Angleton, yeah, he was the head of the counterintelligence CIA. Counterintelligence is basically like he's in charge of basically looking at the spies, looking at who's, he's in control of the espionage in the United States. This whole time, he's the head of the CIA counterintelligence. So he's looking over all of, he's looking over people like Lee Harvey Oswald. He's been spying on him. And because he's, the head of, spies in the country, he was reading the mails that, Lee Harvey Osborn was sending through. And so this was happening the whole time. He was managing it. And Jack Ruby, who killed the assassin, right, killed Lee Harvey Osborn, what he did in turn by killing Lee Harvey Osborn was he silenced him. He silenced, Lee Harvey Osborn. And by the way,
Mm,
a lot of people don't know this, but the guy who killed him, his name is Jack Ruby. That's not even his real name. His real name is Jacob Ruby Smine. Jacob Ruby Smain. That's his real name. A lot of people don't want to talk about that, but
Mm,
that's actually the facts, right? So he's already a bit weird. And by the way, just to mention, Jack Ruby is a Jewish mobster, right? Okay, let me
yeah.
just point that out. So now you have all these inconsistencies. That's like the main basis of the, that's the main summary of the assassination. So basically, there's three major conspiracies surrounding JFK. There's three major
Okay.
conspiracies. Okay,
Yeah.
the most popular one is that the mafia killed him, and
Uh,
basically what it says is JFK made a deal with the mob, right? And because the democratic cities were controlled by political processes, um, and they were basically mobbed up with organized crime and all these other things. Jack Kennedy, who was JFK's father, he really wanted JFK to become president of the United States. And Joseph Kennedy, who's JFK's brother, he went in and he made a deal with the mobsters, basically, allowing them to pour money into the Democratic primary. You know
can
what I
you
mean?
explain that, please?
So basically,
Why
what you have
was
to
he pouring
understand,
money into it?
why was he
What's the
pouring money?
benefits?
So basically, at the
Yeah.
time, so the mobsters who are the mafia, they have a lot of power in these cities. They have a lot of power in, major democratic cities at the time. They're tied in with the governors over there, and they also have a lot of money. They own the casinos, they own all these,
Mm,
big firms.
yes, yes.
Um, you probably know some mobsters. One of my favorite artists, Frank Sinatra, Elvis Presley, they were all part of the mob. You know what I mean? So when I say the
Mm,
mobsters, I'm saying that. So basically, they were basically in charge of democratic states, right? And these
yeah.
democratic states were swing states. So you know what a swing state is?
Yeah, when the state is like divided between Democrat and Republican, right?
Exactly. It was divided between Democrat and Republican. So in order to win, the election, JFK, he needed support from these swing states. These swing states, they were siding more with the Democratic Party. So JFK, yeah, his father wanted him to be president, so he made a deal with the mobsters, and he basically said, "We'll have leeway for you guys." He said, we'll allow you to, commit your organized crime under the, without we won't like look at it, as long as uh, you fund JFK's campaign, and what you do is you also convince certain governors to side with JFK to increase the popular vote for him. And these are the two big reasons why JFK was even elected, arguably. But okay, when you think of mafia, who do you think of? I just wanna ask that. The mafia in America.
Al Capone.
Fair enough. Typically,
Al Pacino.
yeah, like Pacino or like yeah, Frank Sinatra, these type of guys. You typically think Italians, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah, mostly the
You
Italian.
don't really
Yeah.
think of like
Okay, yeah, yeah.
Jewish mobsters. When someone says the mafia, they're talking about Italians. When someone says the mob, you think like Italians. You don't think like Jewish mobsters, right? And bro, and says, you said that this links directly back to them boys, but just to remind you, at this time, this was the 19 this was the 1960s. The U.S. really wasn't in support for Israel at this time. There was not really any.
Mm,
There was barely any Israel USA alliances there. It wasn't as apparent as it is today. So this was a time where it was mixed, right? But yeah, basically,
mhm.
when you think of the mafia, you think of Italians, but there was a Jewish mob, and you might ask, why is there a Jewish mob? So basically, there was during Prohibition. So Prohibition, this was around the 1940s. There was basically a national crime syndicate, and this was basically an alliance between the Italian mob and the Jewish mob. And the Jewish mob was basically helping the Italian mob smuggle money or launder money in Switzerland, right? So they were
Mhm.
they and they were also, yeah, they were basically helping them smuggle money in Switzerland. So they had basically a crime syndicate. They were working together, the Jewish mob and the Italian mob. So during the 40s, during the 50s, during the 60s, the Italian mob and the Jewish mob were basically embedded together. They were one of two. Okay. So that's basically the popular theory, popular theory one, that, the mafia was working, the Jewish mafia and the Italian mafia were working together. Jack Kennedy, who's JFK's father, made a deal with. Okay, I forgot to mention this, but basically Jack Kennedy made a deal with the mobsters to basically fund his campaign. And when JFK became president, his brother Joe Kennedy hated, crime in the city. He hated the mobsters. And what he did is he basically came out with a
Okay.
statement, basically attacking the mob, right? So the mob came out and said, JFK broke his deal. He broke the deal, that Joe Kennedy made for him, and that's why they
Okay.
assassinated him. That's theory number one, right? That the mob did it.
Okay, so the number one theory is the mob was like, "I, so you don't want to hold like your brother's talking shit, and you should protect us.
Yeah,
Fuck you," type of thing, right? Like, yeah, you have to go
yeah,
now.
yeah, 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 exactly.
Okay, okay, makes sense.
Now that's popular. That's the most popular theory, I would say. Then there's but they're all
Okay.
linked. They're all linked, and I'll explain how they are.
Wait,
But
wait. What was the original theory then? Like, was that the original theory number one? Like,
no,
why the
original
guy killed
theory.
him?
I just went. That was the first one I went through. That Lee Harvey Osborn, he was a sniper, and he basically shot JFK, and he was assassinated. So all the information. He was assassinated by Jack Ruby, who was the Jewish mobster. He was assassinated by him.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, yeah. To cover up info.
Yeah, and
Yes,
then
yes,
and then
yes.
he basically like all the info died with him. And the Jewish mobster, he was.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll get into that later. But the Jewish mobster as well, he was because we'll get into it. We'll get into it. But this is popular
Okay,
theory
okay,
number
okay.
two. This is popular theory number two. So the popular theory number two is basically that the CIA did it. That's what it is, right? The CIA killed
Mm.
JFK, and the theory goes they basically said James Angleton did it. James Angleton, right? And they say basically what happened is so JFK said that he wanted to throw CIA the CIA to pieces after the failed invasion in Cuba. So at the time there was a Cold War between Russia and the United States. So this was during the Cold War, 1960s. JFK was elected as president during the Cold War with Russia, right?
Hmm.
And did Aman leave? Anyway,
Someone called him. Not
yeah,
you.
no worries, no worries. I just didn't know. But basically, yeah, so
Oh,
during that time, there was a massive Cold War. JFK was elected during that Cold War, and the U.S. was basically super scared of Russia, right? They were super scared, and
mm,
so the CIA basically carried out an operation in Russia. It was called I forgot what it was called exactly. It was called like the Pig Theory or something like that, right? Where they basically they went out and they tried to garner intelligence, but they failed, right? And they also, yeah, so the JFK hated this, and he basically destabilized the CIA. He fired the head of the CIA, and he was planning on basically like firing everyone, rehiring new people at the time, right?
yeah,
And he was also against a lot of the pretexts that the CIA had. So basically, what the CIA wanted to do is create a false flag in America. So like bomb a ship or something and say Cuba did it. So they now have a reason to go and fight Cuba. Have a reason to launch a
mm,
ground invasion in Cuba. So that's what yeah, that pretext like that is what the CIA was coming with. JFK hated that. In addition. So the CIA thought, JFK was like a communist sympathizer. And the leader of the CIA, what you have to understand, James Angleton, the leader of counterintelligence, he hated communists. He hated the Soviet Union. He despised them. His whole goal in life was basically to, get rid of the Soviet Union. He hated the Soviet Union, right?
yeah.
And so the theory goes that, because the CIA, there was also a bunch of other reasons like, the Vietnam War, you know, JFK wanted to pull his troops out the Vietnam War. The CIA didn't like that either. Um, so yeah, all these different things is why, the CIA basically, you know, killed JFK, and because they're the CIA, they covered up for it. They had, all the documents, so they just, changed them, or they,
But do the
misconstrued
CIA
them.
have that much power
The
in the
CIA
government?
they have a lot
Yeah.
of power. Yeah, they do.
Yes.
They do. Arguably they do. Arguably they do.
Mm,
I don't know.
mm. Like in certain areas, you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, like they have the power. Like they're like the president's hatchet man. You know what a hatchet man is? Like they can carry out the dirty work for the president.
Yeah, yeah,
It's,
like they do the behind the scenes work, you mean?
exactly, exactly.
Mm,
So yeah, that's basically, it summed up. And
okay.
yeah, okay. So now we move on to something else. So many people think the CIA. This ties into what you just asked me, Sedge. So
Yeah.
a lot of people, they fail to understand. Like they're like, oh, explain, how the CIA would be divorced. No, sorry. Many people think the CIA is divorced from, organized crime, right?
Mm,
And but they're not. I'll explain why. And just to reference again, I forgot to mention, but the names of the two people.
yeah.
So you remember I said the Italian mafia and the Jewish mafia were teaming up.
Yes.
The head of the Jewish mob at the time was called Meyer Lansky, right? And the head of the
Okay.
Italian mafia was called Charles Luciano, right? So those were their two names.
Okay.
And basically, what happened? So when Meyer Lansky was running the Jewish mob, and when Charles Luciano formed the crime syndicate in the 1930s between the Jewish mob and the Italian mob, um, yeah, basically what happened is that they basically worked with American intelligence, and I'll explain to you why. I'll explain to you how. So during World War II, there was no CIA, right? The CIA wasn't a thing. It wasn't. It wasn't. It wasn't existent at the time. But there was something called the
Yes.
OSS. The OSS was basically the CIA's, precursor. And during World War
I
II,
remember seeing all this
yeah, the
nowadays.
OSS, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So during World War II, America was extremely, extremely, scared of sabotage, right? They were scared that, the Nazis would sabotage them, sabotage their ports, and they were basically, yeah, they were scared of sabotage, right? And something actually that happened, there was a major explosion in New Jersey, on their east coast, right? And
Hmm.
yeah, there was a major explosion. So the CIA, American intelligence, they were scared of, Nazis walking around in America, basically, threatening to bomb the country, right? So what happened? It was there was a major act of military espionage and military depot. Yeah, and that's why the military depot exploded in New Jersey, right? And so what the CIA did is so the mob basically ran the ports, right? They ran they understood, they knew who everyone was in the cities. They ran the ports, on the east coast of the United States in New Jersey,
Yes.
right? So the CIA actually struck up a relationship with the mob. So military intelligence gave the government, basically, essentially gave the C, the government and military intelligence basically gave the mob clemency. So people like Luciano, or others, protection for in exchange for intelligence. So are you following? You understand that?
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, because they were scared of bombs and all these things, and the mobs, they ran the cities. They basically offered clemency, which basically means um, they allow them to, commit their crimes. They'll turn a blind eye to it. They gave these guys clemency in exchange for protection, and sorry, they gave these guys protection in exchange for intelligence. So, I mean, don't you think that's crazy? When I found that out, I was like,
Very
what the hell?
crazy.
So the CIA was working with the
I
mob.
don't think it is though.
Yeah, I know. Why not? Why don't you think it is?
Because to me, like, it makes sense. It's during World War II, you said, right? So it's
Hmm.
like you work with the lesser evil to defeat the, higher evil, you would say. You know what I mean? Because in
Yeah.
the long run, what's a bigger threat? These small mob groups or like Nazi Germany? And obviously it's Nazi Germany. So it's like, okay, we'll make this
Oh,
small sacrifice now
I wouldn't say it's
for like,
obvious.
the
'Cause
greater good.
I wouldn't say
It
it's
is
obvious.
though.
Not because
Yeah.
the mobsters are also, are very dangerous people.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, but the mobsters need to be within the country, Johnny. The thing is, with the mobsters, right? If the Nazis take over, I'm pretty sure the mobsters are cooked as well, right? Because they American as well, I'm guessing, or Italian, or
Yeah.
Jewish,
Italian
which the Nazis
American,
don't look
Jewish
like as well,
American. Yeah.
right?
Mm.
Right. So they're cooked as well. So it's like you rather work with these guys who are, yeah, they might be, fucking up your country a bit, but it's better than your whole country getting like fully fucked by the Germans at the time,
That's fair.
I would say.
Yeah, but you
But
understand
yeah.
that. So the mob was basically
But it is
working with
pretty
the
mad.
CIA,
I mean,
which is
But
crazy
Aman,
to
what
yeah,
do you
think
think?
about. Yeah, man. What do you
Aman,
think?
what do you think, Aman?
My back surge.
No, no, give us more.
Think I agree with
agree,
Sedge.
bro.
You rather
He
work with
agrees with
the
me. That's
lesser
it,
evil.
bro.
What's this guy trying to
Simple.
do, man?
I don't know, bro. Never to shut up.
What
Anyways,
do you
moving on.
speak?
But it is pretty mad that governments work with mobs. Pretty insane.
Yeah.
I don't know if it happens nowadays though.
It definitely happens
Yeah.
every day in
But
every
the
country.
mob is not like as it's not as
Big, you would say.
big, yeah, nowadays. At
But
least
would
I
you
don't
say
think
the
so.
mob has integrated into governments? So they're not like mobs anymore? They're more
Potentially,
like
potentially,
official status. You know
potentially,
what I'm
yeah.
trying to say, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Potentially, potentially. But yeah, that is true.
Okay, let's keep on. Sorry.
But I'll continue. So yeah, the mob was working with the CIA, right? And what you have to understand, this is
Oh, yeah?
also important. The Italian mafia was transnational. And what I mean by that is the Italian mafia was basically working with the Italians in Italy. The Italian mob in Italy was working with the American Italian mob, if that makes sense. So they were transnational, right? So it wasn't only for the docks that they made the agreement, but also when America was invading fascist Italy in World War II, they actually asked the Italian mob for advice on how to invade, Sicily and all these other
Yo,
countries.
what the fuck? What?
Yeah, because the Italian mob was, situated. Yeah, they were trying. Yeah, so it's crazy. I know it is crazy, but
What? So the mob sold out their country, pretty
Yeah, but
much.
the
yeah,
mob didn't like the fascist government.
yeah,
Yeah, that's fair. That is pretty insane, though. Selling your whole country out.
yeah,
But
yeah.
okay, fair enough.
So this is where it gets interesting. So this is when James Angeleton comes in, right? So when the USA took over Italy, World War II ends. James Angeleton was running military intelligence in Italy at the time. So he was running the OSS in Italy. And when the war ended in Italy, um, Jewish people, right? After the war, after World War II, once the war ended in Italy, Jewish people were fleeing Europe, right? They were fleeing Europe. They were fleeing all, the whole of Europe. They were going to America, and yeah, many of them were going to America, but many of them were also fleeing to Palestine. And by the way, Israel wasn't created. Israel wasn't a country at this time, right? It wasn't a thing. So many of the Jews from Italy, they were or from Europe, they were fleeing to the USA. They were fleeing to places like Israel. And um, the reason they were fleeing to Israel is because even though it was 1945, Israel was not created yet. There was still a Zionist project in Israel, and it was still underway. And the Jewish people were basically settling in mandatorily, under Palestinian control, and you know, yeah, they would just be under Palestinian control at the time, or under, you could say the control of Great Britain, because they really had the power, you know, about of what's going to happen in that country, at this moment in time. So then there was this agency actually in Palestine. It was called the Jewish Agency, and it was basically, controlling, all the Jews that were coming into Palestine, and yeah, it was basically, yeah, it was what was in charge of, bringing the Jews in. It was called, at the time it was called the Jewish Agency. Nowadays it's known as the Mossad. And what's important to understand here is that Italy was the biggest launch pad. You know what a launch pad is. The biggest launch pad to get Jews into Palestine. It was Italy, right?
Yeah.
And James Angelitin was in charge of the OSS in Italy. So when James Angelitin was tasked with creating what would be, an internation intelligence network known as the CIA, he saw the Jews as a source of intelligence. And you might ask, why are the Jews, why are they a source of intelligence? The reason the Jews are a source of intelligence is because the Jews, they lived in Europe. They lived, in the Soviet Union. They knew, about everything that was going on in Europe. They knew about what was happening in the Soviet Union. They knew what was happening with the Nazis.
That's
So
actually
that would
very
be
interesting.
they would be a great source of, intelligence for America. So Angelitin, he started hiring the Jews. He started hiring them as intelligence agents because he thought they might have knowledge, of Europe, of Germany, all these different countries. So the Jews that were going from Italy to Palestine formed the basis for his network, which, in the future would be the CIA. At the same time, the people who were getting smuggled out of Italy, they were also, the Jews that were getting, smuggled out of Italy, that were going to Palestine. In addition to them, getting smuggled out, guns were also getting smuggled out of Italy to now, Palestine at the time. And these were, the surplus of World War II guns after the war. And basically, why you let me see if you can guess. Do you know why guns were getting smuggled to, Palestine, or the Zionist Operation Jewish Agency there?
So they could start
For
a
the
war?
Zionist military.
What? Just one at a time.
Sorry,
Such
go
go ahead.
ahead.
No, you go ahead.
So to start a war,
Yeah, basically,
to
yeah.
like arm for a war in the future,
Yeah. Amand, you should probably
I'm
say the same
guessing.
thing. But yeah,
Yeah, I
that
said for the Zionist military.
exactly. So there was, yeah, guns were getting smuggled out of Italy. After, the whatever was left from Italy, they were getting sent to Israel, or sorry, they were getting sent to Palestine to basically arm the early Zionist group that was forming Israel. So this was done under James Angelitin.
Damn, these guys are like, yeah, but these guys be planning, what, 80 years ahead?
Yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah.
insane.
It was crazy. So this was, in 1945. This happened for about 2 years. And then in 1947, Angelitin came back to the USA. He was moved back to the USA, and he became a founding officer for the CIA. So that's when the CIA was created, 1947. He became the founding officer in the CIA. A year later, in 1948, Israel was established. And in 1948, Israel declared independence, and the whole Arab nation, every single Arab nation in the Middle East declares war on Israel. Egypt, Iran, Syria, um, all the Gulf countries, Jordan, all of them, they all declare war on Israel. And this was the first declaration of Israel. This was the first Arab-Israeli war. And This is very very scary for Israel. I mean, you could imagine, right? I mean, hi, what's up, Grand Designs? How you doing? But yeah, this is a scary moment for Israel, as you can imagine, right? Because
Yes.
If Israel lose the war versus the Arab nations, they basically go extinct, right? They've just gone through a Holocaust. They've just experienced all these crazy things happening to them. You know, a lot of Europeans, they don't even like them. So now they move to Israel. All the Arab nations, 1948, declare war on Israel, and this was the first Arab-Israeli war, and this was really a sink or swim moment for the most part, right? And so what happened is basically, eventually there was a ceasefire, and the USA had an arms embargo on Israel and Egypt. You know what an arms embargo is? So an embargo is basically stopping trade between two countries, right? You get that? You following?
Yes.
So yeah, basically the US stopped, funding or stopped providing weapons to both Israel and and Egypt and all the Arab nations. They stopped funding them with wars because they wanted peace in that nation, right? So this is basically when the Jews started to rely on intelligence and organized crime in the USA with the mob to try help them smuggle weapons from the USA to Israel to fight the war, right? You following?
Yes.
Explain it to me.
You're talking about how they were smuggling weapons. No?
Uh,
But you're not done explaining to
well, basically, what I'm saying is there was this massive war. Now there's a ceasefire, and yeah, this is
But you
basically
said there was like an arms embargo,
yeah. So yeah,
so they
basically
had to smuggle in the weapons.
yeah, you're right. The USA basically had an arms
Okay, okay.
embargo on Israel and Egypt. And this was when so now the Jews basically started relying on intelligence and organized crime in the USA, so the mob, to basically smuggle weapons to the USA to help them fight the war. Now, if you remember, this war was basically primarily against Egypt and Syria. So I mean, if you remember, the government said they would allow clemency. They would allow the mob to get away with crimes. They would turn a blind eye to them. So this was basically how
Yes,
Israel
yes, I remember
was.
that deal.
Yeah, so this is basically how the mob got away with sending weapons to Israel. And if you remember, it's a
Wait, quick
Jewish.
question though.
Yeah,
So at this point, US and Israel weren't like close, I would say,
no, no, they weren't. Like the U.S.
because they
actually
put
hadn't
up.
had any
Okay, okay,
wars
okay.
with any of the Arab nations. They actually had peace with the Arab nations at this time, and there was no real because this was when Israel was
Okay.
just created, 1948. They declare independence. The whole every
Yeah,
single
yeah,
Arab
yeah.
nation declares war on them. Yeah.
Yes.
So basically, Israel at the time they needed these weapons to fight against Egypt and Syria, and Israel basically relied on their transnational intelligence to smuggle weapons out of these surplus weapons into Israel to help them overcome the Arabs. You get me? So they relied
Mm,
on the mob,
yeah.
and because of the mob, the government had a deal with the mob. They basically, there was clemency there, so they were allowed. They turned a blind eye to them sending weapons, and because the Italian mob and the Jewish mob had a crime syndicate together, the Jewish mob could directly send weapons through Italy to Israel to help them fight the war.
Mm,
So
okay.
yeah, and basically, if you remember Mickey Conan, who was the head of the Jewish mob, he played a major role in this, and he was actually a successor to a guy called Bugsy Siegel, who was basically Michael Lansky's,
What?
who's the head of the mob.
That is not his real name, bro.
Yeah, that was his real name, bro. Bugsy Siegel was a crazy name.
Bugsy Siegel.
Um,
Siegel. That's well. Come on.
yeah,
I
but
can't
he was
trust.
basically
Anyways, yeah.
Michael Lansky's right hand man. If you remember Michael Lansky, he's the head of the Jewish mob. at the time. So yeah.
Okay.
So basically, after the 1948 war, Israel was victorious. They humiliated the entire coalition of all the Arab armies, because Israel winning that is crazy, right? They're one nation. They're against the whole of the Middle East. They're against the whole of every single Arab nation, right? You get me? So
Yes.
yeah. So they humiliated all the Arab armies, and this is then we move to the 1950s. So there was peace, there was a ceasefire, nothing was happening. And then in the 1950s, there was a new Egyptian president. His name was President Nasser. President Nasser wanted to unite all the Arab
Yeah.
countries. He was like a nationalist, right? He was a pan-Arabist. He wanted to, unite all the Arab countries based on the fact that they were Arab, right? Just because they're Arab, he wanted to unite them all. So basically, there was this Suez Canal, which was actually owned by Britain and France. So when Nasser becomes president of Egypt, he basically takes over the canal and he nationalizes it. And yeah, sorry, he basically takes over the canal, and and yeah, these canals are owned by Britain and France, and these canals, they're a great source of income. So he basically did it because he can make a lot of money from it, and he took the canal, right? And the UK and France, they didn't like this. They didn't like that, President Nasser, he had this power, he took the canal, but they didn't want to start up a war in the Arab nations. I'll explain that in a second why. But basically, so they basically, went to Israel. The UK and
Yeah.
France, they went to Israel and they wanted to cook up a little plan. And the plan was, Israel should invade Egypt, right? And basically, when they invade Egypt, France and the United Kingdom will come in as, peacemakers, and they'll basically, take back the land, and they'll be like, oh no, let's have peace, right?
Okay.
And yeah, so this was basically the pretext for, France and Britain to intervene as peacekeepers and, take back the canal. And this is exactly what happened in 1956. And the reason why, let me tell you why, you know, you might ask, like, why didn't Britain and France, they're way more powerful than Egypt, why can't they just invade the canal, right? The reason why is because if Britain or France invaded the canal, the Arab countries would be like, oh, these guys are favoring Israel, and they would join the Soviet Union. And Britain and France, they were so scared of the Soviet Union. They did not want a war with the Soviet
Mm,
Union, so they were like, look, we can't do that. We need to, do it some other way.
yeah.
And yeah, so this is exactly what happened in 1956. There was a peace deal, and the reason Egypt did it is, I mean, sorry, the reason Israel even invaded Egypt was because they saw Egypt as a major threat. They were threatened by Egypt, right? They were threatened by President Nasser. He was a pan-Arabist. They didn't want all the Arab nations joining and defeating Israel, because that's a threat to Israel primarily. So that was really the major issue there. And at this time, the USA didn't have pro-Israel foreign policy. Remember that. They didn't really have good relations with Israel. They wanted to maintain good relations with both the Arabs and both the Israelis. And during 1952 till then, I think 1961, if I'm not wrong, it was the USA was run under the president called, President Eisenhower. He was president at the time. And he basically got France and Britain to withdraw from this canal. Okay, he got France and Britain to withdraw from this canal because he was basically scared that the Soviet Union might join the Middle East, and Nasser might side with the Soviet Union because France, Britain, and Israel, they're siding, they're doing these sneaky plans, they're taking back the canal, so the USA was super scared of the Soviet Union joining sides with the Middle East, because that's a major threat. All the Arab nations now against, Egypt won't even exist. I mean, sorry, Israel won't even exist, because if the Arab nations and Soviet Unions teamed against Israel, it's cooked. They didn't want another Cold War. They didn't want like nukes going out and everything like that. And also, this is something that's not talked about. You won't find this information, that's it's broadly out there, But this is something that's not talked about. When Israel went to make a deal with France and the United Kingdom, Israel wanted a nuclear weapon. Israel was super, super hungry for a nuclear weapon. And the president of Israel at the time, or the prime minister of Israel, sorry, was David Ben-Gurion, right? David Ben-Gurion, he was the first prime minister of Israel. He's like George Washington of the United States, all right? That's how you need to remember him, because he's the first prime minister that Israel's ever had. So his name was David Ben-Gurion, and he was obsessed. He was obsessed with acquiring a nuclear bomb. Why was he obsessed with acquiring a nuclear bomb? Because he was scared. He was scared of the threat of the Arab nations. He was scared, of the Arab nations. He wanted to build a nuclear bomb to use it as a threat, against the Arab nations so they don't attack him. So they said, we will only attack Egypt if France give Israel a nuclear reactor, right? And that's exactly what happened. So they made the deal. France accepted the deal. They said, we'll give you the nuclear reactor. All you have to do is invade Egypt and, give us the canal back. So once that happens, after, it's all said and done, it all happens. The French basically go to Israel and they start to build a nuclear reactor in Israel. And yeah, they have this deal. So they're building a nuclear reactor, and they're also supplying Israel with a load of uranium at the time. So that's what's happening there. Do you follow with that point? Do you guys have anything to say about that? Um, Maybe your thoughts.
That's so like in a way it's pretty smart, dude.
How so?
How the US, like UK, couldn't just invade because they were scared of the other nations of joining
Yeah, yeah,
Russia. You know what I mean? Like
yeah.
it's like
That's
okay, makes sense. You know?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Oh shit,
yeah,
makes
yeah.
sense. It makes sense.
And okay, at this time, so this is also something important that I wanna touch on. So JFK, by the way, and his father Joe and his brother
Hmm.
were
But
all
he
not,
wasn't.
huh? Yeah, he
Was he the
wasn't.
president at the time this is
No, no.
happening?
It was President Eisenhower
He
at the
wasn't,
time.
right? Yeah, yeah. You
President
said yeah,
Eisenhower.
his other guy. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, this is just something I want to touch on quickly. That's not
Oh,
talked
okay.
about that much. But basically, this is not 100%, but the new documents do classify this. Basically, JFK and his father Joe and his brother were all Nazi sympathizers. They loved Hitler. Joseph Kennedy especially, he admired Hitler. Before U.S. entry
What?
into before U.S. entry into World War II, Joseph Kennedy was actually outspoken against war. He said the U.S. should not invade, should not get involved in Europe. We shouldn't care about the U.S. war. And and it actually came out, JFK actually wrote in his diary saying the U.S. should have never gotten into World War II. Now he wasn't a Holocaust supporter. I'm not saying that. He just admired, Hitler's power. He admired, the power he had. Maybe his speeches too. So, and JFK, by the way, was actually, he was so, he liked, Hitler so much, he liked Germany so much that he was actually surveyed by the FBI before he was president for his anti-war views. So now, yeah, so these documents are basically coming out, and they basically unveiled that JFK were positive things about, you know, Hitler, and he visited Germany too.
Mm.
So the
Did he
so
not visit Russia as well? I
I'm
saw
not
something like that.
I'm not sure if he
Unless I'm
visited
tripping.
Russia. But he did
Oh,
visited.
okay.
He probably maybe he did. He probably did. I don't know if any American visited them under the Iron Curtain though. But basically now documents have basically so this is why the Jews didn't like Kennedy in the first place. They didn't like the whole Kennedy family, and they didn't like JFK because of Joseph Kennedy primarily,
Mm,
right? And
okay,
the
okay.
Kennedys were also Catholics, and Catholics at the time were associated, with anti-Semitism. They were associated with, they with Jewish hate, and yeah, so it was crazy. And so this leads to, JFK. So JFK, before he was president of the United States, he was a senator. He was the senator of Massachusetts. And at his first speech, he basically spoke of Algerian independence from France. So he wanted Algeria to be basically an independent country, right?
Mm.
And basically, France fought a brutal war to keep Algeria a colony. And you might say, oh, why does it matter if France, if Algeria becomes independent? Israel didn't
Yeah,
want
once, yeah.
Algeria becoming independent because Algeria is an Islamic country. It's an Islamic colony. They didn't want another enemy, right down, in Africa. So they completely opposed, they already had so many enemies, they didn't want another one. So that's also another reason why, they didn't like, JFK from the start, even as a senator, because he spoke for the independence of Algeria. They didn't want Algeria to be independent. They didn't want another, strong Arab country going against them. So you following there? I'm going to touch on a new point now. But yeah, you get that?
Yeah, okay, makes sense.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
that part made sense.
so then there's this guy called Abe Feinberg. He's a Jew, and he's basically the financial backer of JFK's campaign. He's the one who funded JFK's campaign back, when he was running in 1960. He came to JFK and he said, he'll fund the campaign for Israel. He'll fund JFK's campaign with, $500,000. But there was basically a pretext to this, and the pretext was he'll only fund the campaign if he basically with $500,000, which was a lot of money at the time, only if he basically writes U.S. foreign policy on Israel. So he basically writes the script. So JFK agreed. He agreed to this deal, but he was furious. He was very very angry, right? He didn't like that, these he literally went to his best friend and it was written in his diary. And he told his friend, he's furious. He's like, oh, how can these people, they're not even our people. They're coming here and they're dictating our foreign policy, right? So that was basically the deal, right? And in addition, he'd also get help from, the Jewish mafia and, certain swing states, etc. So yeah, they basically said, JFK will be your man, and the if the JFK will be the man, he'll work for the mafia. They basically told the mafia JFK will be your man, and in exchange, the mafia should put money and fund his campaign, and they'll help Israel out. Now, the first thing that happens before JFK gets in is the CIA informs. So you know about Israel, they want to build a major nuclear program, right? Remember that? Remember I touched on that?
Yeah, you just said this
Yeah,
because they
so
wanted nuclear weapons, uranium coming into the country. Yeah.
exactly, yeah. So basically, before JFK got in, the CIA basically informed Eisenhower, who was JFK's predecessor, about Israel's nuclear program. They tell Eisenhower that
Mhm.
Israel is going to, that is trying to get nuclear weapons, and France is, building their nuclear reactor. So JFK, hears about this, and as soon as he becomes, president, um, he learns that, two countries want to build nuclear weapons. These two countries are India and Israel. They want bombs, right? And JFK doesn't like this. He's stressing out, right? He doesn't want other countries with nuclear weapons, right? He's scared, and especially, if they find out that, America or France or any of these, the allies are helping, Israel build nuclear weapons. If the Soviet Union finds that out, the Soviet Union's gonna, not the Soviet Union, sorry, if the Arab nations find out that, France is helping Israel build nuclear weapons and the allies are backing it,
Gonna join the Russians.
then they're gonna join the Russians,
I
and this is
see.
gonna cause a major war.
Mm, yes, yes, yes.
So right after JFK gets inaugurated, he sends a letter to Israel, and he basically said he wants to inspect the Israeli nuclear program, right? He sends a letter. He's like, I want to just inspect it. We're gonna send, U.S. workers. We're gonna send them there, and we just want to inspect what's going on. And yeah, and basically, Israel was super scared of the, Arab nations. Ben Gurion basically wrote a letter back to JFK, and he said, we're scared of the Arab nations. We just came out of a Holocaust, and Nasser, who is the president of Egypt, is invoking Nazi viewpoints. He hates the Jews. So that's what Ben Gurion, he wrote back to JFK saying that. But JFK didn't care, right? He said, look, we need to inspect your nuclear reactors, right? So basically, um, Ben Gurion was scared. Ben Gurion, who's he's the by the way, he's the George Washington, right? He's the George Washington of Israel. He's super scared, and he's basically delaying it, right? He's delaying it. He's delaying it. He's delaying it, right? He's delaying all these letters coming in, and he's responding. He's sending back letters. Oh, maybe later. Blah 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 blah. JFK was super insistent on it. And finally, JFK came. He wrote a letter to Israel and to Ben Gurion, and he said, if you don't let us inspect your weapons, we're not going to support you in the war
Yeah.
against the Arab nations.
Mm,
So now you might ask, what's Ben Gurion going to do, right?
yeah.
So this is crazy. This is actually crazy what happened. So Ben Gurion, the day after the letter was sent or received by Israel, he resigned as Prime Minister of
Oh,
Israel.
what?
Yeah. So he
That's
res-
crazy. That is actually.
so he resigned as president,
That
and
was crazy.
no one actually understands why he resigned. There's no actual information. But basically, the reason why he resigned is when you get a letter and you receive it and then you resign the next day, the letter basically goes undelivered. He didn't read the letter, and he basically resigned. So nobody's seen the letter. So he's basically using it as a way to delay. That's what I think.
So for the next guy can come in.
Yeah, and it takes time for the next guy
Okay,
to
that's
come in,
pretty
so it's
smart then.
delaying, it's
Yeah,
delaying,
yeah, because they'd
even
be
more.
like, "No, I didn't receive it." He was the last
Exactly.
person who received it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay,
So the
that's pretty
next,
smart though.
yeah. So then the next president who comes in, his name is Levy. We'll just call him Levy. I don't know his full name. So Levy received the same letter like 3 months later, and he basically wrote back to JFK and he said, "Look, you know what? He was also delaying, but he eventually wrote back and he said, look, we'll allow some visits into Israel for inspection." And he said the best time.
Why did they wanna like? Why not?
What do you mean? Why not?
Like, why didn't they want the inspection? Why were they delaying so much every single
Basically,
time?
if
Like,
America found out that Israel was making nuclear weapons, they,
yeah.
because they were, connected. I'll explain this later, but they knew that America would basically shut it all down. And what the CIA was telling,
Mm,
JFK is that by 1963, the operators for the nuclear weapons are gonna be secured, and by 1964, Israel's gonna have nuclear weapons. So JFK was, super insistent. He didn't want to wait too long. You know what I mean? So basically, he wrote this letter back to JFK. He said, "Look, we'll allow for some visits for inspection," and he said he wrote to JFK and he said, late 1963 would be the best time for the visit." And what's crazy is the first inspection took place 2 months after Kennedy was assassinated. Um, so yeah, basically they said that in '63, um, the nuclear programs was going to be operational, and by '64 Israel would have nuclear bombs. And basically, when the Americans eventually arrived into Israel and found the reactor, the reactor was already critical, so they couldn't do anything about it. It was too late, right? The Israel already had the bombs. By 1960, sorry, they already had the nuclear reactor operational, and then by 1966, Israel had a bomb. And yeah, that's basically what happened there. And after Kennedy died, by the way, the new president, Lyndon Johnson, didn't even inspect it at all. He didn't really care. He just sent troops there to send them there. He didn't really, he wasn't really on it. You know what I mean? And yeah,
once it wasn't on it.
bro, he wasn't on it, man.
Okay.
He wasn't on it, man. And So now I'll go back to James Angeliton. This is the main guy. James
The
Angelton, he was in
CIA head.
charge.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was in charge of, the counterintelligence. He was working with, and at this point, when he was in charge of the CIA and counterintelligence, he was working with all the agencies like the Mossad, like the OAS in France, the MIS in the UK. And once Angeleton returned to the USA, he basically used the same tricks he learned in France. So, I mean, not in France, sorry, the same tricks he learned in Italy, right? And this is important to remember. He hated the Soviet Union. He was super anti-communist. He hated them, and he basically wanted intelligence on the Soviet Union. But they don't have anybody in the United States from the Soviet Union, right? They don't have anyone. So what Angeleton, began to do is he started to use Jews that left the Soviet Union and went to Israel. He started using them to basically garner intelligence on the Soviet Union. So he basically cultivated his ties with Israel as basically a license. And he basically found out information like, there was this, basically in Shin Bet, they were allowed to acquire, he was in, sorry, in Shin Bet, which is in Israel. Um, they were, so the Israeli Jews, they were able to acquire information about Nikita Khrushchev's speech. So this was the guy who succeeded Stalin in the future. So, information like this was
Okay.
basically getting sent to, was basically getting delivered to um, James Angeleton, right? And the
Yeah.
Jews, they knew this because there was Jews coming out of Russia to Israel, and they were, they had this, alliance. So um, James Angeleton had this alliance with Israel, and they were basically trading information. And the thing is, Israel wasn't giving this information for free. You have to remember that. So the Israelis' number one imperative at the time that this information was being traded, was to acquire a bomb, right? They wanted that nuclear bomb. So, you might say, why would Israel give up, secrets for free? And they didn't give it up for free. So what they were doing is they were trading intelligence. So James Angeleton was trading American secrets for information about the Soviet Union. He actually liked
Mm,
Yeah, so he liked Israel actually, and he saw it like as a democratic society. He thought Israel was like a formidable force, against Russia, against all these other countries. He liked them. So he was trading American intelligence for intelligence about the Soviet Union, which he was getting from Israel. And we're getting to the end here, but basically, if we go back now to, Lee Harvey Oswald, the person who killed
yeah.
JFK, and Jack Ruby, the person who killed Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald, he
Yeah.
was being surveyed by um, the CIA for years, prior to, um, once he came back, because he lived in the Soviet Union for a while, and then he came back to the United States. He was being surveyed for basically a long, long time, and the reason he was getting surveyed is because he basically liked Russia. He, promoted pro-communism ideologies,
Mm,
and there was mails of him doing
they
this.
probably
So
thought
he
he
was
was a
sending
spy.
mails. Yeah, so they thought he was a spy. So they was American intelligence found, the CIA found this out. They were spying on him. They were reading all of his mail, and James Angeleton was basically in charge of reading all the mail and surveilling him. And it was James Angeleton who was reading the mail, right? And basically, last year in Joe Biden's, he leaked a bunch of documents, um, and they actually found the person who was reading the mail, and his name was Reuben Efron, right? His name was Reuben Efron, and he was Jewish. So the person who was
Yeah.
reading Lee Harvey Oswald's mail was Jewish. So the Angelitans, Jewish team in Europe, were reading his mail. So the European Jews, because this Efron was from Europe, they were reading his mail. And the person who killed Lee Harvey Oswald was Jack Ruby, who was also Jewish, right? And the important thing to remember here is, Jack Ruby wasn't just some mobster. he wasn't the lone man. He wasn't the lone gunman either, and he was actually deeply involved, with smuggling. He was in the smuggling weapons tie with a guy called Mickey Cohen. Mickey Cohen was the guy who was the successor um, to Mikey Nowen, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, basically what happened, he was basically a key guy for smuggling weapons into Israel, and yeah, basically, yeah, so basically, yeah, that's practically it. He was basically a key component. He was the one who was sending weapons into Israel, and the person reading Lee Harvey Oswald's mail actually shared a girlfriend with the guy. So they were like super. It was really weird. I don't know
What?
why, but they shared a girlfriend together, and
What do you mean you're sharing a girlfriend?
I don't even know. But they shared a girlfriend. They were super super
Yeah, that's
close.
ridiculous.
So then this just and then now we're waiting upon the rest of the documents because I could speculate now. I'm not gonna speculate, but after listening to all that information, there is reason to believe that Israel was involved in the assassination of JFK, and that's really my final consensus on the issue. I mean, but I want to hear your guys' thoughts. I summarized it all there. We might do another show on it. Getting even deeper on it. Getting even deeper. Um, but yeah, that's
One
basically all I
question
have
is,
now.
right?
Yeah.
Why do they unclassify documents for the public? What's the reason? I don't understand.
What do you mean? What's the reason?
Like, why do they unclassify documents for the public to know? Like, why?
You mean declassify them? Basically, the president.
Yeah,
So
sorry,
Donald Trump wants
declassify them,
to.
yeah.
There's basically been pressure on the government to declassify them for a long time. And one of Donald Trump's cabinet members, who's in charge of environmental stuff, is RFK,
Mm-hmm.
right? Robert F. Kennedy. And he right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's in government right now. RFK. I don't know if you've seen him, but JFK is his uncle, right? JFK is his uncle,
Oh,
and he's really he's pushing for all the documents to be disclosed. He wants the documents about his family to be disclosed to the public. So that's really why it's getting super pushed now. And there's also a lot of political pressure because why would they keep documents about a prior U.S. Um, president? Why about his death, right? Why are they hiding this? So people are also asking
I guess
questions.
that's fair as well. But like it was such a long time ago, so it's like, like what are you gonna do with this information? Like nothing.
Yeah.
Time I feel like.
No, the information. Yeah, I guess it was a long time ago. It doesn't matter, but it explains the Israeli connection to America and why
Yeah, that's true.
everything about the Arab nations, why that war is happening right now, um, everything about it, the Cold War with Russia and the United States. It links to everything. Is what I'm basically saying. But
You
yeah, that's
even
basically it for me.
verify these are true though. You know what
What?
I mean? 'Cause they could just leak like made up documents. I would say, because it's such a long time ago. You know what I'm trying to say, right? Or
Yeah, it
like
was
just
like
not release some things,
80 years ago. No, 60 years ago. Sorry.
right? Or, or just not release some things, or like change up some parts of it.
They might, but I think the
I don't
story,
know,
like they
right?
could, but the it's like it's so like like everyone already knows. They're just waiting for the documents, if that makes sense, because the information's already out there.
Uh,
Because
okay,
the
yeah,
internet
yeah, I
was a
get you.
thing.
Like people already made theories.
Yeah, and there's
It's like
already like a lot
let's
of
wait for
information out there. The
confirmation. Okay.
documents are just there for confirmation on the information.
Yeah, yeah, okay, makes
Like
sense.
like all this information, it's already out there. Maybe the names are missing, like Ruben, the guy Ruben that I just mentioned. He was only
Okay,
declassified last year. But it's really just everyone knows what's happening, and even Kash Patel, who's the leader of the FBI right now in the United States, he basically came out.
yeah,
He
yeah,
said,
yeah.
everything you guys think about JFK, you guys already know it all. There's only a few more things in the because he's read the documents. He's like, you guys already know it all. There's only a few more things here that we have to declassify.